Well, it's a real pleasure to be invited here. I'm really delighted to be part of this programme of reading 3 sets of cantos vertically. Although, as you'll probably realise after about 25 minutes, I'm probably not going to do a lot of vertical reading for a good 20 minutes or so. I apologise for that at the outset. But I'm delighted to be here because I have a strong sense that this is a project that is truly experimental, the format is likely to prove potentially innovative in all sorts of ways. I assume, and I think you alluded to this, George, at the very beginning, that the emphasis on verticality is a kind of reaction against the whole lector de Dantis, that formalised, institutionalised reading of a single canto, which as you know, has a long and august tradition, well, a rich tradition in Cambridge too, under Pat Boyd and Kenelm Foster, Robin himself to some extent. For the very early readers of Dante, probably at least for the first 2 centuries, the lectoro was not simply a way of explaining the poem, it was a way of fighting battles to make Dante authoritative in relation to classical authors, of celebrating civic identity, of treating major theoretical debates. It's not quite like that anymore, I sense. However, today the lectore de Dantis remains popular. It's very, very popular in Italy, increasingly popular in Italy in interesting ways. It's popular in North America and to some extent in the UK too. And thanks to that, the good series that's been happening in St Andrews recently. It's a good teaching device. It's a good way to hear the poem read out loud if colleagues do actually read it all out loud. It's good for engaging the public. And, I mean, concentration on a single canto is far from being wrong-headed. The canto, as you know, is a remarkably innovative Dantean invention. It's a fundamental building block, ideologically and narratologically in the poem. In Dante's hands, the canto is both open and closed. It's wonderfully flexible and varied, thematically and stylistically. The canto is absolutely vital to the performability, memorability, narrative drive, and just sheer success of the poem. But, there was a but coming, but if we are looking for more profound analysis, richer contextualization, a stronger sense of what the poem's messages and strategies are, and close critical reading, even, then the Lectura de Dantis, a bit like Dante commentary, has always had its limitations. And I think those limitations have become especially notable as the Lectura has acquired over time a kind of degree of inbuilt conservatism, a tendency towards self-referentiality, as Dantists look back to the earlier efforts of fellow Dantists rather than looking into the poem or outside of the poem into Dante's culture. Of course, there's long been a basic recognition that we must go beyond the canto, an awareness that cantos need to be fitted into broader blocks of cantos, and a perception that some cantos are more pivotal than others. Some cantos act more like lodestones or lightning rods or echoing points in engaging the reader to reflect on what the poem is revealing. Now, all those terms, I kind of overstress them, pivotal, lightning rods, echoing points, are ones that I picked up from Dantists. Peter Armour used to joke that he could imagine Dante in his peregrinations through the courts of Italy reciting his poems to courtiers, and when he stood up to read a canto, Can Grande's courtiers would nudge one another as he began a canto and say to one another, "Oh no, not Paradiso VII again," one of the most theologically dense in the entire poem, and of course that's one of my cantos tonight. Can't we just have the swooning Paolo and the seductive Francesca again? As I see it, the main way that readers past and present have tended to break down what one might call the constricted hermeneutical possibilities of reading a single canto is through a technique known as reading Dante with Dante. Yeah? Familiar to everyone. Leggere Dante con Dante. That's been practiced right from the very beginning of the exegetical tradition. It's not a 19th century invention, although it was revitalised in the 19th century. In the 16th century, it's almost a kind of exegetical axiom that an author is best explained by his other works, or by the same work. So I think the task we've been set by George and Heather is at one level a peculiarly privileged form of reading Dante with Dante. Sort of stating obvious. But of course we know that some patterns of verticality across numerically corresponding cantos are so emphatically marked out that they amount to powerful structuring principles. The 6s with politics, the 15s and 16s with exile, the 25s and 26s with questions of the body, language and poetry, the 10s with questions of nature, artistry and fame. But a more systematic effort to engage in vertical reading across the entire poem, with a real openness to what might be uncovered, or the fact that nothing might be uncovered, has not yet been made. I've been dipping into the back catalogue of videos, that side angle shot, made so far, and I thought it might be helpful at this point to coming to the end of the first year, to take some stock, at least provisionally, of what verticality seems to mean, and to offer some of my own kind of reflections and suggestions on that. I'm going to spend kind of 15 minutes or so doing that, if that's not too much of a transgression of the format. I am going to get into the sevens at some stage. I'm going to wheel round to them at some stage. So, I mean, in the first week, George spoke about thematic and structural correspondences between the vertical line of parallel cantos as they intersect with the horizontal axis and the narrative pathway through hell, purgatory, and paradise. Heather, you raised a very interesting parallel with medieval art, and tantalisingly raised that parallel, and the way that vertical readings are used to establish typological relationships. Matthew Treherne, he drew attention to his shoes, but he also drew attention to the need to look closely at language and questions of form. Yeah, he also tried to pinch a little bit of material from my canto, the bit that I listened to as well. Vittorio Montemaggi played very suggestively with what verticality means in terms of surprise, suspense, the overturning of expectation, through the whole idea of doing a handstand. It's a very interesting entrée en matière. Claire Honus, who again sort of inevitably trespassed on my canto, made movements forwards, backwards, sideways, starting in mid-canto of the central purgatorial canto. So another kind of technique there. From what I've watched so far, the main approach seems to have been thematizing and grouping concerns, and I'm going to do some of that, but I probably want to concentrate, maybe more than others, although I haven't absolutely listened to or watched all the back catalogue, so I may be misrepresenting. I'm going to concentrate a bit more closely on issues of formal intercanto correspondences and echoes. First, though, I want to say more things about vertical reading. Why it's productive, how it's been practiced in the past, what its limitations might be, in a kind of an attempt of kind of re-engaging with earlier material and kind of spirit of openness and looking forward as well. So I think the first thing to note is that we're not working entirely in a vacuum here. I know 3 or 4 essays, some going back to the 1980s, that actually use the term vertical reading. Although I've started to notice other people using the word vertical reading again, and I'm sure that they are now indebted to George and Heather. So there is a kind of a non-original origin to that term from this point onwards, if I can put it that way. There's an essay by Victoria Kirkham on the... I'll move one slide down. So that's an absolutely terrible PowerPoint slide, isn't it, to present you with bibliography. And I meant to give you a handout, but I was rather rushed, I'm afraid. So I've had to put that on a slide. There's an essay by Victoria Kirkham on the 11s. There are parts of a monograph by Richard Schoaf on the 30s, the narcissist myth, that absolutely centrally deal with issues of verticality. I think perhaps the best known essay in Dante studies is from 1981. It's on the so-called technique of the parallel episode, La tecnica degli episodi paralleli, by Amilcare Iannucci. Iannucci draws attention to the way that Dante criticizes himself, performs a kind of self-exegesis by consciously aligning episodes that have parallels. Okay? Not aligning parallel cantos, but aligning episodes that have parallels. And the essay is important and interesting too, because Iannucci notes how this kind of technique of the parallel passage has strong foundations in medieval biblical exegesis. So I think it's important in that way. But let me reflect a little bit more on the productivity of the exercise in Dante. As I see it, it comes down to 3 interwoven things about the textuality of the comedy. The way the poem is structured, the way it is fashioned and textured formally, and the relationships it sets up with readers. Kind of all obvious stuff. But let me go in a little bit more to each of those areas. And obviously I'm separating them out for the purposes of exposition, but really they are always tightly interwoven, intertwined. First then, structure. Our ability to... maybe I should go back off that slide because it's kind of not very kind, is it, to be honest? First then, structure. Our ability to discern patterns, and this applies especially and pointedly, I think, to parallel cantos, is in part a product of the Dantean concern for order and structure, for symmetry and balance in all he does. And remember, this isn't just something that is a feature of the Commedia, it's a concern in the Vita Nuova, the Convivio, the De Vulgari Eloquentio as well. So we're all familiar with the 3 cantiche, the 33 cantos, plus 1. Of course, the plus 1 raises interesting questions in your vertical reading. 34 for the Inferno, given the presence of the prologue, perhaps also its deformity. And actually, I think that raises this kind of question, well, where does the vertical line actually come? Are you going to have someone doing just Canto 34? How is that going to work? And again, people know the other kinds of parallelism, 3 subsections of each cantica, 3 guides, the end of the poem on stelle, the predilection for numerical correspondences of various kinds. Of course, there's a further powerful biblical underpinning here. The Book of Wisdom, 11:26, God ordered all things in measure, weight, and number. A really, really widely cited text in the Middle Ages. Dante himself, probably particularly sensitive and susceptible to a sort of neo-Pythagorean Christian love of numbers. Don't worry, I'm not about to engage in exercise in numerology for the rest of the lecture. Remember that this is very much a matter of poetry too. In the De Vulgari Eloquentia, of course, poetry is defined in relation to rhetoric and music. Music reflects the order governing the entire universe, and that order should regulate human nature too, through correspondences. And I should say, a kind of numerological aside, that 7, I think, is a key number. And its associations are especially with creation and perfection. The early 5th century Platonizing commentator of Cicero and Virgil, Macrobius, he was well known to Dante. He viewed the number 7 as key to the universe, as a kind of regulator of the entire fabric of the human body. And so I don't think it's coincidental that creation and the human body are major concerns, especially in Paradiso 7, but in effect oppositionally kind of reflected or mediated already in Inferno 7. So to use that celebrated, if actually flawed analogy, we might think about the ways that the poem has been compared to a great Gothic cathedral in which all parts cohere and concord, all particularities and facets form part of an intricate system of correspondences in a grand design. I'm actually slightly uneasy with this parallelism in all sorts of ways. One might borrow analogies from other fields, and I often think of the Russian poet's comment that, Mandelstam's comment that future commentary on Dante belongs to the natural sciences, his essay on talking about Dante, and that it's unthinkable that one might encompass, I'm quoting, it's unthinkable that one might encompass with the eye or visually imagine to oneself this shape of 13,000 facets with its monstrous exactitude. He goes on, Mandelstam goes on, I'm quoting again, European Dante criticism has nailed Dante to the landscape of hell. Robin made a similar comment in talking about the Fives. I carry on with Mandelstam. No one has yet approached the Commedia with a geologist's hammer in order to ascertain the crystalline structure of the rock, in order to see the particles of other minerals in it, to study its smoky colour, its garish patterning, to judge it as a mineral crystal which has been subjected to the most varied series of accidents. So in part, I see vertical reading as kind of taking a geologist's hammer to the poem in various ways. Well, we'll talk about that. So my first point is a point about structure and the nature of that structure. My second point, language and form. It's possible and productive to engage in vertical readings because of a piece with Dante's love and imposition of symmetry is that remarkable craftsmanship of the poem, the incredible attention to the word that means Dante is constantly marking out correspondences for the reader based on a whole system of intratextual verbal echoes, repetition across cantos and cantiche of key words or images, of linguistic formulae, of patterns of rhyme or rhyme series that invite us to go back to the earlier usage. And again, well-known stuff, but just to give a few examples, take key words such as amore, follia, punto, poeta, all the successive uses, or nearly all the successive uses of those words, bear on one another, as do textually prominent terms of phrase like come al tui piacque, of course, Inferno 26 and Purgatory 1, rhyme patterns like amore, ardore, valore. To keep with the sevens, I actually finally coming into the sevens, labia, abbia, rabbia, that rhyme series. A similar pattern based on consciously patterned recurrences is found too around certain motifs or figures. Think of the references to Ulysses in each cantica, or to Ovidian figures such as Narcissus, Python, the Argonauts. Think of biblical figures, Paul and David when they recur, not necessarily across all three, sometimes across two, but often across three canticae. Even philosophers such as Aristotle, the successive recurrences of Aristotle or allusions to Aristotle refine a perspective, or open up a new kind of perspective. All of that, again, really at the risk of excessive analogies, makes the comedy into this kind of great echo chamber of reverberations. So extraordinary craftsmanship, inextricably woven with structural considerations to create this intense and intricate play of symmetries, verbal, conceptual and thematic. Of course, none of this would matter if there were not the third feature that we need to add, which is the reader. In particular, the way that Dante constantly invites the reader to return, to go back, to reflect on what has come, to compare and to cross-reference, to revisit. And again, the productivity of vertical reading lies really essentially here, I think. Of course, Dante does this most notably and emblematically, probably with a number of addresses that he makes to the reader. But really, they're in a nutshell a kind of meta-literary staging of the poem's overall approach to its readership. A bit like similes too, I tend to think. Equally, when the protagonist himself, late in the journey, is twice told to look back on his journey so far, ti rimirare in giù, or addimare viso, Paradiso 22 and 27, that backward glance is almost a trope of how to read the poem in retrospect. Now, I'm sure we all remember the Singleton essay, the Vistas in Retrospect, from over 45 years ago, on the role of the reader's retrospective vision, how meaning is only fully seized at certain key terminal points and at the end of the poem. The central argument that patterns are revealed in retrospect down the unfolding line of the journey. Singleton focuses in that essay on a single word, ruina, showing how successive appearances of that word connect up with the earthquake of Christ's death, illuminating that moment with progressive clarity. I think more valuable and more critically alert than Singleton's study is one by Zig Baranski that's actually quite neglected. And it's a study on structural retrospection around what Baranski sees as a pivotal canto, Purgatory 27. And that essay, I think, really shows the need to look back before the end of the poem. It shows how some cantos have a greater role than others. And that raises an interesting question for verticality. It shows how the reader is constantly called upon to do this by precise textual and situational echoes. It shows how the whole kind of realm of intercanto correspondence and echoing is part of Dante's mastery of the poem and part of his own presentation of his control and authorship over the poem. That essay too gives some tantalizing suggestions about ways in which medieval rhetoric, the medieval sermon, discuss and utilize techniques related to disposition, order, repetition and correspondence. All of those often within a framework of backward-looking reference. And I actually think there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and it may be interesting if that kind of work comes out of these vertical readings on trying to historicise and understand better how forms of vertical reading were practised in Dante's culture. So exploring, in line with Heather's suggestion, medieval art, but also biblical exegesis, questions of ordering and correspondence in late medieval rhetoric, questions of the kind of complex spiralling structure in late medieval sermons, the medieval art of memory as well. All of those categories, I think, could be usefully exploited and interrogated. As far as the limitations of reading vertically across parallel cantos, then 3 or 4 points, if I may, if this isn't too kind of indiscreet and ungenteel to try and kind of criticise what is such a kind of noble and generous and interesting project. I mean, much of the bibliography that I showed on that slide and the couple of essays that I've been mentioning don't really deal with vertical readings as such, but that's not necessary. Again, that may be a gap. Pivotal cantos is an issue. You know, the Commedia has textually privileged cantos. Those cantos resonate more prominently with other cantos. So what does that mean about other cantos in between? Do they all resonate equally? Sorry, I'm kind of throwing things out here, but you know, I haven't got absolute clear answers. I don't think there are. Second, what are our criteria for evaluating parallelisms thematically and formally? Is there not a risk that, you know, we what seems like a parallelism is not? It's just the kind of raw material of doing a long narrative poem of this kind. So a kind of an urge to caution that I'll probably break in my own analysis, and you'll be quite right to pull me up on. And thirdly, I think there's a problem of too narrow a concentration. Remember that the organisation into blocks of cantos and bigger blocks and right out into the whole poem itself. So the same 3 points that make vertical reading productive also mean that we can't restrict our reading to those cantos alone. We need to constantly, I mean, I know you're absolutely aware of this, we need to constantly extend the net of our correspondence to all areas of the poem. So our reading needs to be as alert to the progression of reading at all levels as possible. I think the kind of ideal reader's memory needs to be almost as mobile as Dante the character's gaze in the poem. Perhaps we need to apply to our reading a kind of oscillating movement, di qua, di là, di su, di giù, well, certainly a kind of weaving backwards and forwards. So I think I've said enough on kind of contexts of various kinds of vertical reading, its great productivity, its potential areas to explore, potential limitations, other aspects. Let me try and move into my own reading. First with some rubrics that might give a better sense of the narrative segments of each canto. Apologies for those of you that know these cantos intimately well. I just want to kind of set up the frame across the three cantos, because I'm not going to be exploring inevitably the cantos in the kind of depth they deserve individually. So Inferno VII, opening with a bestial, demonic, infernal guardian Pluto shouting out incomprehensible words. Virgil silences the monster. Dante cites but does not recognise, they remain anonymous, the damned in the fourth circle of hell, the avaricious and the prodigal, who circle around one another. A lengthy disquisition by Dante's guide Virgil on fortune really dominates the heart of the canto. Then, though, we enter a new circle of hell, the wrathful and the sullen, fully immersed in the river Styx, gurgling up bubbles of air from underneath the water. Purgatory VII opens with a sequence very strongly carried over from the previous canto, focused on the meeting between a late 13th century mantua and troubadour, Sordello, and Virgil. Remember, Virgil is still, of course, accompanying Dante, if not guiding, accompanying Dante. Through that encounter between Sordello and Virgil, we discuss Virgil's status, again, the inability to move upwards in purgatory after dark, and then the second half of the canto is caught up with the absolutely exquisite description of a valley of great natural beauty and the 8 earthly rulers or princes that inhabited it, the Valley of the Princes. Paradise VII, opening with a hymn of praise to God from a speaker who's dominated the previous canto, the Emperor Justinian, and then pretty much the whole canto is taken up with what some might describe as a kind of lengthy theological disquisition by Beatrice, a full 130 lines, on creation, original sin, punishment of mankind, the incarnation, and atonement. This is the reason, in Peter Armour's view, why Can Grande's courtiers might have been put off. If we're to remain alert to the progression of reading at all levels, as I've been suggesting earlier, and the need for a kind of oscillating, weaving movement of the reader's memory, then I'd offer the following intercanto pointers, and this is just really a sketch of that kind of third point about limitations of vertical reading. Some of these are obvious, some of them are less obvious. There'll be plenty of others too. So Pluto's nonsense language, sends us ahead to the giant Nimrod's gibberish in Inferno 31. His lack of clarity sends us ahead to discussions of poetry and clarity in Purgatory 26. Pluto's swollen, impotent rage can be related quite closely to Capaneus in Inferno 14. You get the same rhyme set, rabbia, labia, abbia there, applied in lines 65 to 69. There are also connections between Pluto and Lucifer in Inferno 34. The maledetto lupo outcry against avarice in Inferno 7 sends us back to the she-wolf in 1, and then ahead to the terrace of the avaricious and the prodigal in Purgatory 20, where the lupa, the wolf, appears again. The tendency to connect avarice with the clergy, remember all the sinners in Inferno 7 are tonsured. That's picked up again monumentally and memorably in Inferno 19, and then again in Paradiso, especially Paradiso 9 and 28, where the pursuit of money is linked to ravenous, rapacious wolves that are the leaders of the church. So all those themes kind of tying in and knitting again together. Virgil's discussion of fortune needs to be linked again to the terrace of the avaricious in Purgatory 20, lines 13 and 15, where the rotation, wheeling, the rotation of the heavens is mentioned in the context of an address to end the rapacious dominion of the she-wolf. Also Paradiso 16 comes into this, where fortune is again explicitly associated with heavenly motion, with Dante's fate, and with Florence. Virgil's entire presentation of fortune in Inferno 7, he presents fortune in effect as a kind of angel, an angelic minister of God's providential design, which is a kind of special motive force in the heavens that causes changes of fortune down on earth. All of that discourse can be located against discussion of an angelic operation and its relationship to the cosmos and providence and order in Paradiso 1, Paradiso 2, Paradiso 8, 9 and 28. Purgatory 7, that's really strongly bound up with 6, as I mentioned earlier, and actually the political material flows over into the following canto, I think in a way that doesn't happen in Hell. But the discussion of Virgil's plight sends us back to Limbo, Inferno 4, and actually the later description of the Valley of the Princes, where the 8 princes are encountered, that establishes a whole series of really interesting recalls that take us back to Limbo 2. Shadows, size, isolated place, limitations of human action without faith. The intense natural beauty of the valley itself can be counterpoised with the supernatural beauty of the engravings on the first terrace of Purgatory. The pairing of former enemies amongst the princes in a kind of now harmonious concord, that gains new light from the perspective of former enemies, intellectual enemies, harmoniously reconciled in Paradiso 10 to 14. The celebrated apostrophe to human probity, rarely being an inherited virtue, that's re-examined from Purgatory 7 in Paradiso 8 in relation to human talents and their providential redistribution. I go on, I have to pause for breath. Paradiso 7, tightly and strongly bound up with the previous canto. Of course, the whole long discourse is at one level, at a superficial level, a kind of response to paradoxical terminology in the previous canto, as you know. But Paradiso 7, with its attention to the heavens, questions of order, metaphysics, theological discussion of sin, atonement, redemption, resurrection, that needs to be related pretty much to all the earlier poetic theological discussions of Beatrice in Paradise. The role of divine providence is progressively refined in the following 2 cantos, 8 and 9, and then again in 29, the beginning of 29. Situational parallels, specific motifs, verbal echoes. One might draw attention to the way that Beatrice's smile makes one happy in the fire. That's a very strong strategic recall of Purgatory 27, where Dante is enticed through the fire by the name of Beatrice. The idea of a freno or a rein on human will needs to be related back to Purgatory 6. The idea patterns related to the distinction between creation and generation that are kind of fundamental to the setting up of the argument that Adam is divinely created and hence helps us to understand the resurrection of the body. All of that is first adumbrated in Purgatory 25, in that crucial canto there. The metaphorical system of imprinting of divine power on wax of celestial matter That's a metaphorical pattern picked up in Paradiso 1 and then again in 13 and weaving through. Words in Paradiso 7 like folia, cortesia, ped and rhyme, they need unpacking against the other uses of those words. They're key words, it seems to me. The image of the divine creation of the human soul sending us back to Purgatory 25 but also back to Purgatory 17. And the ending and the resurrection of the body sends us scurrying away right throughout the poem to all sorts of images of corporeality and resurrection. So I'm sorry for this, but it's that kind of crisscrossing, interweaving, scurrying around that I think is needed as well as vertical reading. But I'm going to finally enter into the laboratory of vertical reading now, if I may, in the final part of my talk. I think the thematic fields across the sevens where we have the most interesting overlaps, and they are overlaps where I think the patterning works formally through parallels of invented language, parallels on rhyme series, some repetition of key words, colpa, pene, giustizia, seme, vendetta. So I think the three main areas I'd like to highlight are questions related to language and the human voice, first. Second, and hence the title, my title is disappointing in some ways, so I'm not going to talk a lot about justice, but I will talk about heavenly power. Secondly, motifs related to imagery of wheeling, going up and down, dancing, worked out across the three cantos. And thirdly, a series of parallels that involve progressive refinement of perspective. Now, the first point, language and the human voice, I view that as working very, very oppositionally across the vertical reading. The other parallels, progressive refinement of perspective in relation to themes such as fortune and providence, heavenly power and human will, the interrelationship between justice, sin and suffering. So I want to work through those kind of three fields in the time that's left to me. So first then, the openings of Inferno 7 and Paradiso 7. Now, one couldn't wish for a better example of the suggestiveness and the potency of vertical reading. Sorry, I don't want to seem too damning on vertical reading during the course of this now. I'm going to get excited about vertical reading at this point. It's actually rather little commented on, the Inferno 7, Paradiso 7 connection. We have two examples. Let me move down. We have two examples of invented language, unexpectedly opening the respective cantos, balanced symmetrically in the same position in each canto, and in each canto moving on to a wider response, a theological and ethical response almost, to that vocal utterance. Inferno 7, very famous, pape satan elepe. This is the audible but unintelligible utterance shrieked by Pluto, in a voce gotcha, a kind of harsh, grating, clucking voice. Now, if you read the Lectura Dantis on this, there's a veritable kind of teleological pursuit of meaning here. And the pursuit of meaning, I think, leads us astray. The commentators and critics have tried to trace these words and come up with what this means in Hebrew, Greek, Arabic, French, English, various Italian dialects, Modernese, Genoese, even to Maltese dialect, I think. Joyce made fun of this, and of the line itself, of course, in Finnegan's Wake. The words are really, it seems to me, yet another mark or a marker at one level of Dante's linguistic expressivism. What Dante is doing is inventing artificial nonsense language from a kind of bricolage of pseudo-words and phonemes from other languages, including Latin and Hebrew, and hence why the commentators can kind of try and reassemble around Hebrew words. Now, of course, Pluto's words bear directly upon the theme of language and its failure, both in the segment of the poem that extends from Inferno 3 to 9, blocks of cantos again, in interesting ways. Remember 3, 5, 6, Virgil reaffirming against demonic opposition the preordained nature of Dante's journey. More narrowly within 7 itself, there's a whole kind of play with language and its failure. Virgil's words, his parole ornata, juxtaposed with the impotent garbling of the demonic guardian, and that kind of opposition between linguistic efficacy and garrulous verbal utterance is foregrounded in the discourse on fortune in the middle of the canto, lines 70 to 99, and also at the end of the canto too, where we move into the Stygian marsh, and those souls are completely immersed in that marsh, and they gurgle and bubble up, audible but unintelligible bubbles of sound from beneath the murky depths of the marsh. And actually, the lack of a parola integra, a kind of whole word, is seized upon at that point. And again, I think ideas of wholeness and integrity are key across the cantos too. I'm not going to particularly touch on that. I think still broader and fundamental implications lurk here between the connection between language and ethics, and particularly the way that moral and spiritual failings are reflected not only in deviant applications of language, but also in distortions of vocal utterance. I mean, of course, that's a major theme of the Inferno. The barking of the souls in line 43 is another example within 7. But I think the full extent of that deviance, its lack of clarity, and the ethical failings, they don't fully emerge until we compare oppositionally Pluto's utterance with the equally mixed, equally inventive language which Dante strategically places at the opening of Paradiso VII. Hosanna sanctus Deus savuat super illustrans claritate tua, felicis ignis aurum malacoth. This is the Emperor Justinian's opening hymn of praise to the deity, and in it Dante is using Latin and Hebrew words. If anything, compared to Inferno VII, Dante is more inventive at the phonetic and lexical level. That super illustrans is a kind of Latin neologism. I certainly haven't come across it in patristic authors that I know, although super terms are, of course, very widely used and can be linked with Pseudo-Dionysian concepts and terminology. So it's very inventive there. But the alignment of the two examples of invented language in parallel cantos absolutely encourages us to compare. And if we do, the oppositional tensions between the openings is profound. Unlike Pluto's animalesque phonemes that don't make sense, Justinian's hymn of praise to God, rich in liturgical echoes, is mellifluous in the extreme. And it, of course, has morphology and syntax, which is crucial. The lack of any semantically organising structures in Pluto's vocal utterance helps us to appreciate, seen from the perspective of Paradiso VII, that lack of semantically organising structures helps us to appreciate more clearly the context of the earlier canto, the nature of the speaker, the utterance itself. It contains the physical attributes of speech, but it cannot be articulated into a meaningful sequence. The oppositional nature of the two passages, viewed along, again, the vertical axis, informs the narrative sequence that follows. So here we can contrast Beatrice's luminosity and smile with Pluto's swollen labia, the sweetness of her drops of wisdom, and remember, sweetness is a key element of poetry for Dante. The sweetness of her drops of poetry with the voce chioccia, the attention Dante pays to the syllables of Beatrice's name and the power of syllables over him, causing him to pass out, to the inability of syllables to signify in Pluto's utterance. The lack of poder, of power in Pluto's words. And of course, interwoven in this is another retrospective recall of the Vita Nuova in interesting ways. And I don't know whether earlier speakers have got into the minor works in this level too. The delay and the dreaming remind one of earlier chapters of the Vita Nuova as well. Okay, so that's my first big set of vertical readings in the canto. Moving on to the second point, I think a further oppositional element is built around the motif of dance. Dante's almost kind of sarcastic presentation of the souls of sinners of the avaricious and prodigal in line 24 of Inferno VII forms a sharp contrast with the harmonious dance of souls marked up in line 5 of Paradiso VII. I think that's the first real dance moment in the Paradiso, and it's part then of a broader motif and patterning that really reaches a rich intensity again in Paradiso 10 to 14. That kind of core of the Paradiso, it seems to me. But the dance motif is also part of a broader set of pattern concerns across the sevens, with circling and wheeling, and I want to spend some time on these. Of course, circling and wheeling most explicitly highlighted with the Wheel of Fortune, line 97 of Inferno VII, Volve la sua spera. But wheeling has already been anticipated in the movement of the avaricious and the prodigal, weaving back and forth in circular motion. The idea of fortune, though in Inferno VII as providential wheeling, I think needs to be re-examined in the light of passages on movement up and down in Purgatory VII, where we learn it's impossible to ascend without divine grace, even though one can tornare in giuso, one can go back down. Have I got that passage there? Yes. It's the passage that Virgil doesn't really understand very well, has to have explained to him, interestingly. That reason why progress can't happen in anti-purgatory after nightfall. So they're drawing a line in the sand beyond which he can't go. And the notion of difficulty of ascent is again returned to more implicitly in lines 121 to 123, here patterned out in the inability of probity to move genealogically in circles. It just doesn't work that way. It doesn't go back up properly. Paradiso VII treats the idea of circularity not only through dance, but in theological and metaphysical terms with the idea that man could not obtain satisfaction for original sin by, again, words repeated, ir giuso, going up through humility, because his disobedience had tried to reach up so high. Yeah? There is a need to go down, ir suso. So again, giuso, suso, chiuso, forming a rhyme series, binding those two cantos together, refining the relationships between fortune, humankind, grace, divine liberality, forms of human motion, divine intercession. And again, Paradiso VII, towards the end of the canto, picking up again in a cosmic key the idea of heavenly rotation again. My third and final point, thematic parallels across the discourses. And again, I think these are not to be fitted in so much oppositional framework, but progressive refinement of understanding through enlargement of perspective. I mean, there are all sorts of elements and material here. I haven't kind of got time to kind of work through or elaborate on them, but words like vendetta, justitia, pena, the whole explanation of justice, sin and punishment, vendetta only touched upon in Inferno, justitia kind of shouted out in Inferno, but then properly articulated in Paradiso. The relationship between power and will, again, seems to be motifs and themes that work across the cantos and illuminate one another from a higher perspective. Allusions to the resurrection of the body, even other particular kind of key words like semme, and I've given some examples of other kinds of cross echoings as well of various kinds that I think could be worked up and elaborated in interesting ways. I want to just stay with the discourse on fortune and work through again this idea of refinement from retrospective higher perspective. Now, we know that Virgil's set piece on fortune is built around Boethius' Consolation of Philosophy. I mean, not entirely, there, isn't it, Dante? draw on other elements and play with that. But the lament in Inferno VII, the explanation of providential power, the imperscrutability, the speed of movement, the way fortune is cursed by men, the emptiness of things assigned to fortune, the image of the wheel, the idea of fortune as a ruler, even the earlier simile to Scylla and Charybdis, all of those are Boethian elements. All of those, are kind of too many to list almost. But there are Boethian echoes in all the sevens, and I'm not sure the point has quite been worked out. It may be interesting, and again, throw me out if you think this is not working. I think there may be interesting ways in which vertical cantos can allow one to reconsider dominant intertexts if they are reworked through later cantos. So what I'm thinking about is the way in which that passage, Purgatory VII, 121 to 123, can be very closely related to Book 3, Meter 6 of the Consolation of Philosophy, verses 7 to 8. Why boast of your stock, since none is counted base, if you consider God the author of your race, other than people who with foul vice desert their own birthright. So ideas of lineage, of God as the origin of lineage, of human vice, besmirching that line very, 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 very directly addressed in Purgatory 7, 121 to 123. And then again moving into Beatrice's discourse, those central lines talking about la divina bontà che da sé sperne ogni livore ardendo in sé sfavilla sì che ti spiega le bellezze eterne, those lines very, very closely modelled, almost calqued on the great celebrated Timaean Boethian hymn of Book 3, Meter 9. But Boethius has forma boni, yeah? Dante has divina bontà. Yeah? So interesting that Boethius is being Christianized, Platonized, Christian Platonized there. I mean, maybe unconscious, maybe drawing on intermediaries like William of Conch, who pick up on Platonic ideas and feed them into the Boethian text. But it's interesting because it seems to me that at one level this might be a way of recontextualizing Virgil's own Discourse on Fortuna. Because remember, for the early readers, there were two things in particular that were deeply problematic about that passage. The way in which Virgil called attention to the other gods, and the way in which he described necessità as making fortune fast. Both of those raised all sorts of anxieties in the earlier readers and had to be explained, or were attacked by people who had a particular animus against Dante. So it's interesting that we have then, through the sevens and through a patterning very closely based on Boethian intertexts, a progressive development and refinement of those Boethian elements in a way that presents Virgil's Discourse on Fortuna as inhabiting a more limited perspective in various ways. And again, one might think too about the ways in which Inferno VII's presentation of the angelic backdrop and cosmos being equally pervaded by light resplendent in all directions and with equal intensities, contrasts rather markedly with the presentation of light as being variably received. Of course, we go back to the opening lines of Paradiso I here as well, with which Inferno VII is often compared. But it seems to me that there's a remarkable difference too at work here that may be working in the same kind of format. Okay, I think that's that's all I have. I'd like to end there.